Good evening. Welcome to the San Antonio International Airport Noise Exposure Map Update webinar for the 2021 baseline conditions. All participants are automatically muted upon arrival and will remain so through the entire meeting. And those who are attending using Zoom can only see our panelists. The workshop will be recorded, and the recording, as well as other materials, will be made available on the airport's Noise Office website. You may notice that I or other speakers will periodically pause. This meeting is being translated to Spanish in real time, and we want to make sure the translators are able to understand us and that they have enough time to translate before we move on to the next item. If joining from your computer, please select the language globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen to select your preferred language. Also select mute original audio unless you want to hear both English and Spanish. If you're attending using Zoom and are having trouble viewing or hearing, please use the Q&A feature found on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and someone on our technical support team will assist you. Or you can text 205-697-3432. Again, that's 205-697-3432. Today's workshop is expected to run about 2 hours and includes a 20-minute pre-recorded presentation. At the conclusion of the recorded presentation, we will answer your questions in the order they are received. To submit a question, please use the Q&A icon found at the bottom of your screen. Please note, these will not be considered official public comments. Please follow the instructions on the airport's Noise Office website and in the newspaper advertisement to submit your comments on the NEM update. For those of you who have called into this workshop but are not in the Zoom interface, please text your questions to the same number I mentioned previously, 205-697-3432. As a friendly reminder, if joining from your computer, please select the language globe icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen to select your preferred language. Also select mute original audio unless you want to hear both English and Spanish. As we begin this meeting, I would like to pass on some comments that were made by Councilman Perry from District 10 and Councilman Courage from District 9 during our public workshop on Monday evening. Councilman Perry thanks airport staff, Jesus, Steve, and Josh for organizing these workshops so that we have an opportunity to provide public comment on the current conditions noise exposure map that will be presented tonight. These workshops provide an opportunity for all of us to learn more about the FAA's Part 150 process and how the noise exposure map that will be presented was developed and how the future conditions map will be developed. Finally, Councilman Perry looks forward to watching how these workshops go and then coming back in the new year when the next set of workshops is held with the future conditions map. Councilman Courage congratulates airport staff for initiating the current noise study and conducting these public workshops. The residents of District 9 have been significantly impacted by airport noise in the past, and addressing it is a top priority for him. It is important for all of us to let the airport know our daily concerns regarding airplane noise in our neighborhoods, especially as the COVID-19 pandemic has added an additional impact to our airport operations. Finally, Councilman Courage encourages all of you to contact his office with your concerns or any feedback from these public workshops. I will now turn this over to the Director of the San Antonio International Airport, Mr. Jesus Saenz, who will provide some brief opening remarks before we share the pre-recorded presentation.
Welcome to the San Antonio International Airport virtual public workshop for our Part 150 Noise Exposure Map or NEM update. I am Jesus Saenz, Director of Airports for San Antonio Airport System. I'm here today to personally thank you for joining us in this virtual workshop and to give you a little history. The City of San Antonio completed its first comprehensive Part 150 study in 1990 and has conducted numerous updates throughout the last 30 years that have resulted in a comprehensive noise abatement and mitigation program. This NEM update will allow us to better understand the current noise exposure environment as well as the current concerns of our nearby communities. This is the first of two series of workshops that will occur during the NEM update process. This first set of workshops will review the assumptions and resulting contours associated with the development of the draft 2021 Existing Conditions Noise Exposure Map. The second set of workshops is scheduled for early 2021. Will focus on the 2026 Future Conditions Noise Exposure Map. It is important to note that in this first set of workshops, we will only be discussing the airport's existing conditions, and any discussions regarding potential eligibility for future noise mitigation measures will take place during the second set of workshops in early 2021. We have historically conducted our public workshops in person, but in an effort to remain compliant with current COVID-19 guidelines and encourage maximum participation while maintaining the safety of everyone in our community, we've adapted our approach to a virtual platform. I know a virtual approach may not feel as personal to some, but I am optimistic that we can still have an engaging and meaningful discussion around this noise exposure map update. Thanks again for joining us in this conversation, and let me assure you, we look forward to hearing all of your questions as well as your concerns. After all, that is why we are here.
Hello, and welcome to the virtual public workshops for the San Antonio International Airport's Part 150 Noise Exposure Map Update. I'm Steve Alverson, the Environmental Science Associates Project Director for this study. We appreciate you attending this workshop today, and your participation and input is a key component of this study. This presentation will provide you with information about the 14 CFR Part 150 study process, how sound is measured, how we model aircraft noise, what is considered compatible land use, the draft 2021 Existing Conditions Noise Exposure Map, and the next steps for the Noise Exposure Map update. "14 CFR Part 150 refers to Title 14 of the Code of Federal Regulations Part 150, and it outlines a voluntary process that an airport sponsor can undertake to understand and address non-compatible land uses in the vicinity of an airport. Noise studies, including a noise exposure map update, must comply with 14 CFR Part 150 guidelines in order to be accepted by the Federal Aviation Administration, or FAA. Part 150 establishes a methodology to prepare the aircraft noise exposure maps, or NEMs, and noise compatibility programs, or NCPs, when applicable. If NEMs show that there were non-compatible land uses, then an NCP can then be undertaken. Importantly, the process also provides the airport sponsor with an opportunity to engage local stakeholders, including you, and hear their concerns. The proactive engagement process of Part 150 is an excellent way to educate the community about the existing noise environment and identify areas of non-compatible noise exposure and their potential eligibility for noise mitigation. It's important to note, however, that in today's workshop we will only be presenting the draft 2021 Existing Conditions or Baseline Noise Contours. Eligibility for noise mitigation will not be discussed until we present the 2026 Future Conditions Noise Contours, which we are expecting to present in a second series of public workshops early in 2021. Aircraft noise is regulated at the federal level. The FAA is a responsible federal agency and will ultimately accept the NEMs once they are found in compliance with the requirements of 14 CFR Part 150. The FAA approves flight procedures and certifies pilots and aircraft, both of which influence noise in your area. State law establishes a zoning and land use compatibility framework. Although local governments can establish noise ordinances, aircraft operations are exempt from those ordinances. As such, as the owner and operator of the airport, City of San Antonio, has very limited authority in adopting noise restrictions. The city is primarily responsible for building and managing airport infrastructure, such as terminals and runways, to meet the needs of the traveling public. Local jurisdictions and states can promote compatible land use through methods such as zoning, establishing real estate disclosure requirements, and mandating sound insulating building materials. (14 CFR Part 150) requires documentation of the noise exposure in the vicinity of an airport, specifically the day-night average sound level, or DNL, in terms of the 65, 70, and 75 contours. A noise contour depicts levels of equal noise exposure. The NEM reflects the DNL contour presented over land use base maps. Base maps depict an airport's layout, local land use jurisdictions, major land use categories, noise-sensitive receptors, and other information required by 14 CFR Part 150. All land uses outside the DNL 65 contour are deemed by the FAA to be compatible with aircraft noise. 14 CFR Part 150 requires NEMs for 1, the year of the submittal to the FAA, and 2, a 5-year forecast. Therefore, this study will develop noise contours for the 2021 existing conditions, or baseline year, and the 2026 future condition year. For this Part 150 study, 2019 airport operations were used to represent the 2021 baseline operations. In consultation with the FAA, it was assumed that no growth in aircraft operations occurred between 2019 and 2021, given the global slowdown in aviation activity due to the COVID-19 pandemic. This is an overview of the NEM update process. Up to our current point of the first set of public workshops, we have identified key issues, gathered and analyzed airport and aircraft operational data, developed land use maps, and generated draft noise exposure contours for the 2021 existing condition year using the FAA-approved Aviation Environmental Design Tool, or AEDT. Our next step is to analyze the population and land uses associated with these noise contours and document the findings in the NEM update report. There will be a second round of public workshops early in 2021 after we publish the draft NEM update report. Once stakeholder comments and draft report are reviewed and addressed, a final NEM report will be presented to the FAA for their acceptance. The FAA has adopted the day-night average sound level, or DNL, as the primary metric for the 14 CFR Part 150 studies. DNL represents the total cumulative sound exposure in decibels over a 24-hour period. This metric considers the total number of operations at an airport over the course of a day. For Part 150, we were required to evaluate the annual average day. To reflect the increased sensitivity to noise at night, DNL uses a 10 decibel weighting for nighttime events between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Because noise is measured on a logarithmic scale, this essentially weights each nighttime event as equivalent to 10 daytime events. Average annual day aircraft noise exposure is calculated over a broad area and depicted using contour lines of equal noise exposure. The left side of this slide shows the building blocks of DNL, which involve generating hourly average noise levels and ultimately a 24-hour average sound level, plus the addition of the nighttime weightings for each hour between 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. This slide shows that various activity levels can combine to result in the same amount of noise exposure. While two people may experience the same noise exposure in DNL, they may experience a very different number of aircraft overflights and noise levels depending on the time of day and where they are located around an airport. This study is required to use the FAA-approved Aviation Environmental Design Tool, or AEDT, version 3C. AEDT uses detailed aircraft operational information to generate noise contours. Data inputs used in the modeling process include aircraft fleet mix information, such as aircraft type, arrival and departure times, trip distance, runway use, flight track location and usage, and weather conditions such as average temperature and humidity. For this Part 150 study, we generated the draft 2021 existing conditions noise contours by using actual 2019 calendar year operational data. Noise modeling provides airport sponsors with key insights into the current and projected noise levels in the vicinity of an airport, especially how the noise exposure is affected by changes in aircraft fleet mix or changes in aircraft operations and procedures. It can also provide the community with insights into noise exposure as well as how that noise exposure is anticipated to change over time. You may be wondering why we use modeling instead of actual noise measurements. Well, noise measurements provide noise levels at a specific point and can be helpful in understanding trends. They provide limited information when evaluating DNL over a broad area surrounding an airport. Noise monitors may also include the contribution of non-aviation noise sources. As a result, FAA and Part 150 regulations require the use of a computer model to determine the noise exposure. This allows calculation of noise exposure at numerous points around the airport and also enables the prediction of future exposure levels based on the expected changes in aircraft activity. Regulatory guidelines for noise and land use compatibility are included in Table 1 of Appendix A of 14 CFR Part 150. The FAA has established DNL 65 as the significance threshold for noise-sensitive land uses such as residential, places of worship, and schools. All land use types located outside the DNL 65 contour are considered compatible for the purposes of 14 CFR Part 150. The land use study area, which extends 30,000 feet from each runway end, is depicted here. Existing and future land uses around the airport are identified and characterized within this area to serve as the formation of the land use map. Because the details of this land use map are difficult to see in this virtual workshop setting, a high-resolution map is available for download at the Airport's Noise Office website. Noise-sensitive land uses include residences, places of worship, schools, libraries, hospitals, and more. To accurately capture all the various noise-sensitive land uses, we consulted more than a half dozen publicly accessible data sources to gather the information. All noise-sensitive sites within the DNL 65 noise contour are depicted in the land use map and will be identified in the noise exposure map update. The airport conducted its first Part 150 study in 1991, which signaled the beginning of the noise program and office. Since then, the airport's been extremely dedicated to understanding current noise conditions through multiple updates to the noise exposure maps and working with the community to reduce their noise exposure to aircraft noise through multiple updates to their noise compatibility program. The airport currently has a comprehensive and proactive noise management program with a very high compliance rate for noise abatement measures. The airport's noise outreach program is also quite extensive, and to maximize transparency, it has invested in systems that allow daily and monthly reporting, an online noise complaint portal, and more. San Antonio's noise program and best practices are often referenced by airports seeking to further enhance their noise programs. This year, the airport wrapped up its Residential Acoustic Treatment Program, or RATP. The RATP was a huge success for both the airport and the community. With help of millions of dollars from the FAA, more than 3,300 housing units received acoustical treatment. It's important to reiterate that this is the first of a series of workshops only covering the 2021 existing conditions, noise contour. And the next set of workshops scheduled for early 2021 will discuss the 2026 future condition noise contours and potential eligibility for future noise mitigation treatments. The airport's Noise and Operations Monitoring System, or NEMS, was installed in 2017 and is extremely useful in capturing aircraft operations data, determining noise levels during aircraft overflights, and tracking complaints related to noise from the community. All of this information is accessible by the community via a portal on the airport's Noise Office website. The airport currently operates 12 noise monitoring terminals, or NMTs. They are generally located within a few miles of the airport along arrival and departure paths to each runway. While these NMTs can capture certain data related to each aircraft overflight, it's important to note that sound levels they record do not contribute to generating the noise contours we will present here today. NMTs measure sound at a single location and therefore cannot be used to determine the cumulative noise exposure over a very large area. Part 150 requires us to use 2021 forecasted aircraft operations numbers in the AEDT noise model to determine the 2021 existing conditions NEM. Because the COVID-19 pandemic has seriously disrupted global aviation activity, looking at future aircraft operations is filled with a tremendous uncertainty. Rather than trying to capture and model that uncertainty in consultation with the FAA, we use the latest reliable full year of aircraft operating data, which was calendar year 2019 and is shown here. The number of aircraft operations is the biggest factor in the size and shape of the noise contours. As previously discussed, aircraft operating at night receive a 10 dB penalty, so the time of day can have a noticeable effect on the D&L contours. Aircraft departure stage length is an important factor affecting the size and shape of noise contours. Stage length is the distance an aircraft flies from the airport to another airport. Shorter flights typically involve smaller and lighter aircraft and are usually carry less fuel. As such, their departures are quicker and steeper, which means people on the ground are exposed to less noise for shorter periods of time. Generally, the larger planes and the longer the stage length, the more noise exposure to people on the ground. Runway utilization is another important factor affecting the size and shape of the noise contours. Heavier runway utilization generally results in larger noise contours. Importantly, the airport cannot control runway utilization. It is determined by the FAA Air Traffic Control Tower, construction on the airfield, prevailing weather conditions, operations at adjacent airports, and pilot preferences. Here we see the current daytime runway utilization. It's interesting to note that runway 13 right is the overwhelmingly favorite for daytime arrivals, and runway 4 is the most used runway for daytime departures. Current nighttime runway utilization generally sees the same proportional usage patterns, but interestingly, arrivals on runway 13 right and departures off runway 4 are even higher at night. The next 4 slides depict the actual flight tracks or paths of aircraft departing and arriving at the airport. Flight track data was taken from the airport's NEMs and entered into the AEDT noise model to generate the noise contours. Arrivals appear as red lines, departures appear as blue lines. Touch-and-go operations, where aircraft take off and immediately circle to land for training purposes, appear as green lines. The thicker lines represent higher concentrations of aircraft operations, and the thinner lines represent lesser concentrated flight paths that disperse from the main tracks. On the side, you see flight tracks for aircraft operating on runway 4. These are the flight tracks for aircraft operating on runway 22. Here are the flight tracks for aircraft operating on runways 13 left and 13 right. And finally, on this slide, you see flight tracks for aircraft operating on runways 31 left and 31 right. This is the draft 2021 existing conditions or baseline noise exposure map. The D&L 6570 and 75 contours have been placed on the existing land use map, which essentially means that this map depicts aircraft noise exposure over all land uses in the vicinity of the airport. The noise contours are represented by solid lines. These contours represent equal levels of noise exposure surround the airport and are generated by an extensive noise modeling process. Because the details of the NEM are difficult to see in this virtual workshop setting, a high resolution of the map is available for download at the airport's Noise Office website. As you can see in this comparison of the 2014 and 2021 D&L 65 contours, there has been some noticeable changes in aircraft noise exposure over the past 5 years. Changes in aircraft fleet mix and an increase in aircraft operations and changing runway use patterns have all contributed to differences in the D&L 65 contours over time. As we previously have discussed, the very next step in the Part 150 study process is to develop the draft 2026 Future Conditions Noise Exposure Map. Beginning in early 2021, we will circulate draft noise exposure map update report for community review. We will also be hosting a second set of public workshops similar to these, where you will have another chance to ask questions and provide official public comments. Our goal is to submit the draft NEM report, which will include your comments and our responses to the FAA by the spring of 2021. Questions submitted via the Q&A feature of the Zoom platform during the interactive portion of the virtual public workshops are not considered official public comments. If you would like to submit an official comment, we encourage you to send your written comments by either email or regular mail to the addresses provided on this slide. These addresses will be provided again at the end of today's workshop. We ask that you please submit your comments by 5 p.m. on Friday, November 13th, 2020. All formal comments will become a part of the project record and will be included in the final NEM report. On behalf of the City of San Antonio and the entire Part 150 study team, I want to thank you for your interest and participation in the San Antonio International Airport Noise Exposure Map Update.
Please note, the purpose of this workshop is to help provide information and address your questions about the NEM update. Your questions will not be considered official public comments. Please follow the instructions on the airport's Noise Office website and in the newspaper advertisement to submit your official questions and comments on the NEM update. We will start by answering the questions that came through during the presentation portion of the meeting, and we will continue by answering questions in the order that we received them. We may group questions based on related topics, so please don't be concerned if we don't immediately answer one of your questions, but we will attempt to answer them in the order they were received. During this workshop, the Part 150 study team and airport staff will be responding to questions relevant to the NEM update process. While we value all input, we kindly request that other questions not related to the NEM update be directed to airport staff outside of the workshop environment. And you can email the airport at airportnoisehotline@sanantonio.gov. I would now like to introduce our panelists. I'm Autumn Ward. I am a Senior Noise and Environmental Consultant with Environmental Science Associates, or ESA, and I will be serving as the virtual platform facilitator for today's Part 150 public workshop. ESA is a consulting firm hired by the San Antonio International Airport to conduct this NEM update. ESA has decades of experience and has completed noise studies at airports across the country. Steve Alverson is an airport noise and acoustical expert with ESA and is the project director for the Part 150 study. Neil Wolf is ESA's project manager for the Part 150 study and is responsible for the day-to-day execution of the consultant team's work effort. Mike Arnold is a senior vice president with ESA and is providing oversight on the Part 150 study update process. Chris Sequeira is a noise and air quality modeling expert with ESA and provides technical insight into how the noise model operates. Joshua Heiss is the noise abatement officer for the San Antonio International Airport and is the airport's project manager for this Part 150 study. And Steve Southers is the environmental manager for the San Antonio International Airport. As a friendly reminder, myself and the other speakers will periodically pause to ensure the Spanish translators have enough time to translate before we move on to the next item. You may also notice that they say "Thank you, Autumn" after each question, and that's just to help the translators and those listening in Spanish to know that a different person is speaking at that time. And now we're going to begin with our first question. This one is for Joshua. As citizens who live nearby, will we have any input regarding the changes planned for expansion or change in direction of the runways? So if you can explain the master plan and how that, give them a little bit more information that's different from the study.
I think that that's an important question to ask, and what's unique about this is that while we look at the noise exposure map update, we're looking at updates to sound specific to the airport in the next 5 years. The strategic development plan has a much longer vision for longer terms, and it would be most appropriate that if individuals wish to get updates on the status of the strategic development plan, its schedule, and its next round of meetings, that they visit the strategic development plan website to get the latest details and allow them the opportunity to provide their input during the discussions about development at the airport and plans for the future.
Thank you. Our next question is for Steve. How were you able to do baseline 2021 and assume no growth while the airport was undergoing a major expansion? The justification had to be based on estimated growth?
Thank you for that, passing on that question, Autumn. So we are all in this COVID-19 situation now. We know that operations at airports throughout the United States and San Antonio International Airport were growing rapidly up until when COVID-19 hit. And what happened at that point in time, basically in the February-March timeframe, is that passenger aircraft operations dropped dramatically. And so we saw a real decline in those operations, while cargo, in some cases, remained steady or only dropped a small portion. So the question became, how do we depict the 2021 baseline when we know that the operations in 2021 are probably or maybe less than they are currently in 2019. So in consultation with the Federal Aviation Administration and the airport staff, we decided that using 2019 as is, all the operations at the airport would make sense to keep those numbers fixed and use them as 2021. So the likelihood is those operations may be higher than what we'll see in 2021 if the operations don't rebound rapidly.
Thank you. The next question is similar. I'm going to give it to Mike. Given the current state, air traffic for 2020 and 2021 would reflect the shift in mail order traffic, as you mentioned, COVID. Can you clarify?
Sure. We have seen a shift as a result of the increased reliance on air cargo for people to get the things that they need on a day-to-day basis without visiting stores and shifting into this kind of online mode that we're now living in. And what we'll do is, as we develop our analysis and assumptions for the 2026 timeframe, we're going to incorporate the trends that we're seeing not only in the air cargo side of things and trying to determine what that looks like for the future, but also in the broader rebound of activity and the future fleet side. One thing that we do know is that airlines, in reaction to the downturn in activity, have accelerated the retirement of many of the older aircraft that currently operate in the airline fleet in exchange for aircraft that are often more efficient. And many of those older aircraft are oftentimes the noisier aircraft that are currently operating across the country and here in San Antonio. So we'll be working through that process relative to that 2026 contour that's discussed both in the presentation and through some of Steve's comments as we try to project what noise might look like and that noise exposure in the future.
Thank you. The next question I'll give to either Steve Alverson or Joshua. They asked if they could put their address in somewhere to see if they're within the contour map.
I'll go ahead and start with that. So we're generating two contours, one for 2021 and one for 2026. At this point, at the 2021 stage, which we're discussing in the public workshop, we haven't looked at the noise impacts. That is, which homes are in the contours and which ones are out. We will be doing that as a part of the 2026 map development and then producing that information in a report that will be out for public review. There isn't a function in order to be able to put your address into a map somewhere, but the graphics should be good enough and clear enough so that you'll be able to see where you live in relative to the contours on the map. I should also add too that the process of determining eligibility is separate from the noise exposure map update and could potentially follow on if the city decides to pursue a noise compatibility program or NCP. That decision hasn't been made yet. So what I'm saying is if you happen to be in the noise contour, that doesn't necessarily mean that you would be eligible for a program. There would be another step after that that would need to be followed.
And I'll follow up with Steve's comments as well. In the event that you're a homeowner and want to investigate your location on a map, the Airport Noise Hotline can help you through that process by identifying a version of the map electronically or even in hard copy if you require. Just call me at 210-207-3847 and we'll work through that issue and find a solution to help you gather that information. You can also use the Airport Noise Hotline, which we've referenced frequently in this presentation, Airport Noise Hotline at sanantonio.gov, and we will address it as the concerns and comments come in.
Thank you. The next question, Steve, you just touched on a little bit, but maybe you can expand and also explain the difference again between the NEM update and the NCP. The question is, will the Sound Insulation Program, or RATP, be available again in 2021? I was told in 2018 they were out of funding.
So the previous RATP was completed just this year, earlier this year. So that progress, that program is done and finished. And the purpose of updating the noise exposure maps is to see if in fact there are noise sensitive uses, homes, schools, places of worship, hospitals, within the new set of noise exposure maps. And in particular, we're interested in the 2026 contours because that's where we might expect to see growth in operations again after the COVID pandemic. So the answer is we don't know at this point. We need to develop the 2026 noise exposure map. We need to have that public workshop in early 2021. And at that point, with that information, the city can make a decision about whether to proceed, if needed, with the noise compatibility program. And at that point, there would be a determination as to whether there would be a noise compatibility program. And it's a big policy issue that the airport and the city needs to consider carefully.
Thank you. Joshua, the next question is for you. Where can we get a copy of the slides that were presented?
Thank you. In order to get a copy of the slides being presented, you can contact me at my phone number at 210-207-3847, and we can coordinate to have copies provided to you in hard copy. You could have them emailed to you. They're available at 5 of the area lower libraries surrounding the airport in the contact-free pickup areas. It's just a matter of calling the libraries in advance, and they'll make the materials available to you so that you can keep those and look at them at your leisure. You can also email the Airport Noise Hotline at sanantonio.gov, and we can fill the request and provide you with a link to those presentation materials. They're hosted electronically on the Environmental Stewardship website, and we'll get to see that website towards the end of the presentation through a QR code or the actual presentation link itself. So there's a variety of different ways you can go to get this information. It's the same website that you go to, that you went to register for this presentation. That link will be available to the materials on the right side of the screen as well. So it's up to you to pick your method of picking up the materials. Look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Joshua. The next question is for Steve. What are the night hours of aircraft operations?
So I guess that could be answered, and thank you, Adam, a couple of different ways. In terms of the definition of the day-night average sound level, or DNL, which is the metric that's used to define the noise exposure at the airport, the nighttime hours are from 10 o'clock at night to 7 in the morning. Every operation between those two time frames is treated as though they're 10. Essentially, there's a 10 decibel addition to each operation because we understand the sensitivity to noise during the nighttime period. Separately, if the question is about is there a limitation on nighttime operations at the airport, there's not. The airport's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to allow those operators who need to use it to use the airport. And that's because the city receives federal funding to maintain and keep the airport up. And as a result of those grant assurances they provided to get that funding, they need to ensure that the airport is open for use. So I hope that both those answers answered that question.
Thank you. The next question is for Chris. I often smell aircraft jet fuel exhaust during engine run-ups at night. Is this an environmental hazard? It's very strong, even though I live in a neighborhood some distance away.
Thanks for the question. So certainly we acknowledge your concerns about the aircraft exhaust emissions that you can smell. Through the process that we're presenting today in this public workshop, we are specifically looking at just the noise levels associated with aircraft operations. So that includes aircraft in flight as well as aircraft on the runways, taking off and landing. And as a part of this process, the ultimate outcome is a noise exposure map, as mentioned previously, for 2021 and 2026. I'm not sure if Steve, Southers, or Josh may have more information about some avenues where concerns on air quality could be possibly addressed.
We do work on air quality here at the airport, and we do not have any studies right now regarding the product of the exhaust from the aircraft. And is it an environmental hazard? It depends on the level of particles that are coming to your house. I don't know of any plan to measure those particles in the near future. In San Antonio, generally speaking, we don't have such a huge air quality problem as some other cities do, where they're actually taking active measures to address that.
Thank you. Our next question is for Mike. When I called about noise abatement windows for my home in 2018, I was told that my home was built too recently to be part of a noise abatement program. Will this date threshold be adjusted as part of the noise map update? My neighborhood has a great deal of noise and missed the deadline by only a few years.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, no, that date would not be adjusted. The FAA has established a new noise policy back in 1998 that now requires consideration of the date of construction and whether the home or the location has ever been located within a high impact area around the airport. And those residential areas that were built in areas that had previously are shown to be potentially exposed to those higher areas, they're generally not qualified for participation in a residential acoustic program. Essentially, the FAA wants to avoid committing federal dollars to insulate homes that are constructed in areas that are known to be potentially exposed to the higher noise levels around airports.
Thank you. Steve, do you expect any increase in military use of the airport?
So thanks, Autumn, for passing that question along. So military operations tend to stay fairly constant over time. And in terms of forecasting them, because it's our national defense, the military isn't keen on giving us forecasts about their operations in the future. So in general, the military operations tend to hold fairly steady. Certainly if Joshua or Steve Suthers knows of any military plans for increasing them, perhaps you can share them now if you're aware of any.
No, Steve, that's a good observation. There's no planned employments or assignments of military units at the San Antonio International Airport. Talked a little bit about this earlier in the week at some of the other meetings, and what we often discussed is that there are a number of fixed-base operators or FBO offices surrounding the airport that have contracts that help fuel and provide light maintenance duties to military aircraft that pass through. And it's often the case that military aircraft would leave from another location in the country for a training mission to move the aircraft across the country. And if they happen to need a fuel stop and San Antonio's in proximity, they can come here, pick up fuel, and be on their way. While there are military bases that surround the airport at Randolph and at Lackland, those bases have specific training missions, and we accept the military vehicles from all different branches of service and different airframes. And Lackland and Randolph, while it's possible they could pick up the fuel, they would have to fall in the slot with the training mission, and we can fill that need faster here with the FBO offices. So that's part of the reason that we see the military aircraft pass through the San Antonio airport. It's not that anybody's based here, but they do stop by for fuel and maintenance.
Thank you. Chris, what affects noise exposure?
Thanks for relaying that question, Autumn. Concerning noise exposure is the ultimate result of many factors, and there are factors that we specifically look at in the modeling process, but even outside of modeling, typically the factors that affect noise exposure are number one, the flight paths of aircraft. In other words, where they are in relation to the ground, in relation to the residences in the vicinity of the airport. Aircraft altitudes, both in arrival and in departure, also affect noise exposure. And very closely related to that is the aircraft type. As aircraft and engines are measured in combination for FAA's noise certification. So in other words, the FAA does not take an engine off an aircraft and measure just that. The reason is because aircraft noise generation is a product not only of the engine, but also of the body of the aircraft, or as we typically say, the airframe. That airframe engine combination is actually present in a database in the FAA's AEDT, and as a matter of fact, there are over 3,000 airframe engine combinations in AEDT that we can use in our modeling to get a pretty good picture of the type of aircraft fleet that operates into and out of San Antonio Airport. So I've talked about the flight paths, I've talked about the climb and descent performance of aircraft, talked about the aircraft type. The weather at the airport also has a big impact on noise exposure, not only by affecting aircraft performance, but also by affecting the way that noise propagates from the aircraft to people on the ground. And once again, the FAA's AEDT model has FAA-provided data as well as methodologies to represent both of those things so that we get an accurate picture of the noise exposure around the airport. And particularly for the purpose of modeling, Steve Alverson has described the day-night average sound level in the presentation that was displayed earlier. That noise metric provides an additional 10 decibel weighting for operations occurring at nighttime, which in DNL means between the hours of 10 p.m. and 7 a.m. Those operations with their 10 decibel penalty essentially weights an operation at night as 10 operations in the daytime. So all of these factors affect noise exposure both in the actual environment as well as in our modeling.
Thank you. The next question is for Steve. What is the difference between noise monitors and that data versus noise modeling?
Thank you for passing along that question, Autumn. So the noise monitoring system at the airport has an array of noise monitors that are set up in the community, and it measures the noise 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it tells you what the noise exposure is at each of those particular monitors. It doesn't tell you what the noise exposure is in locations that are not near those noise monitors. So while it provides great historical information and past trends, it doesn't provide any information about what the future noise exposure is, nor does it tell us about what noise exposure is over a broad area. That's where modeling comes in. Noise modeling allows us to develop noise exposure maps, noise contours for a very broad area around the airport. And so we can not only see what the noise exposure is at each of those monitors, but throughout the entire community. The other advantage to noise modeling over noise measurements is that we can predict what the future noise exposure is. We can put in the future fleet mix, put in the future operations, if there are any changes in the aircraft fleet mix as well as flight tracks, and model what the future noise exposure is. So those are the primary differences between monitoring and modeling.
Thank you. The next question is for Neil. How can I provide input on the study?
Thanks, Autumn, for that question. So first, let me start off by saying that 14 CFR Part 150 does require the public to be able to provide the public an opportunity to provide comments on the study process. And basically that is why we are here for these first sets of workshops, because we want to hear your inputs and comments on the work that we're doing for a number of reasons. One, really importantly, is that we want to make sure that the information that we put out is accurate. And so part of this interaction between the consultant team and the public is to verify that our assumptions are correct and excuse me, are correct. As a number of us have already alluded to, there will be a second set of workshops. Those are tentatively scheduled to occur in early 2021. We're not quite sure when that will occur, but as we get closer to those sets of workshops, we will be publishing or advertising out to the public a draft NEM update report, which will contain all the technical details of our efforts, including all of our modeling assumptions. It'll also include the draft 2026 feature conditions noise contour map in there. And so the public will have an opportunity to review that prior to the workshop. And then at the workshop, they will be able to provide comments just like they are tonight. And we will address those comments, and that report will go to the FAA. So there will be a number of opportunities for the public to provide their input during this process.
Thank you. The next question is for Steve. Does a Part 150 study analyze sleep interference or speech disruption?
Well, in a sense it does, in that the noise exposure contours do have some relation to speech interference and sleep disturbance, but not directly. In that the contours are meant to try to provide a level of protection for the community around the airport. It looks at those people that are highly annoyed, are within the contours, and then that annoyance level drops off. The speech interference and sleep disturbance are really related to individual events. And some of those events can be quite loud. And if they're at night, they can also potentially awaken people as well. But we don't specifically pull that out as an item that we look at in the Part 150 study separately.
Thank you. The next question is also for you. Once modeling is completed, will there be additional physical monitoring stations installed in the neighborhoods if needed?
So thanks, Autumn, for passing that question along. The installation of additional noise monitors would be related to the undertaking and completion of a noise compatibility program. And as I indicated earlier, that's a separate process from what's happening now. This is the noise exposure map update, the first stage in trying to understand where the impacts are around the airport, if there are any, and what they are in 2021 and what they will be in 2026. Again, if there are noise-sensitive uses that are impacted in 2026, then the city could potentially undertake that noise compatibility program. One of the measures of that that might be considered is there a need for additional noise monitors? And if there's a discussion about that, then the city could potentially look at that. But we're getting ahead of ourselves in this process. Right now, we're only focusing on the noise exposure map update. And again, join us for the public workshops in early 2021 to see the 2026 noise exposure map, see the documentation, and to see if, in fact, there are any homes, noise-sensitive uses that are within those 2026 noise contours. I also want to emphasize, too, that while the noise monitoring is helpful to the noise office in its daily duties, it isn't used as a part of developing the noise exposure map. So it's a separate piece of information that doesn't directly relate to our NEM update.
Thank you. The next question is for Mike. Does the fleet mix change over time?
Yes, it does, Autumn. The fleet mix, airports are very dynamic, and airlines are constantly evolving their schedules to meet passenger demand. And each airline operates a full array of different aircraft types suited to the specific needs of that particular market. And as that demand ebbs and flows and they adjust their schedules, you'll see different types of aircraft serving those passengers. So a popular market may have a larger aircraft flying it, or it may have a smaller aircraft with more frequencies flying it. And so that, both of those have different effects on what the fleet mix characteristics of the aircraft are. And just so people know what we're talking about by fleet, we're talking about the aircraft fleet and the aircraft that essentially are flying and that we're modeling and that you're experiencing the noise impacts from. So they're constantly evolving, and airlines are always trying to figure out a better way to move passengers, a more efficient way to move passengers. And so we see that continual trend in evolution in the operation and the different aircraft types at the airport.
Thank you. The next question is for Joshua. If we are registered for this workshop, will we be notified when the 2021 workshops are scheduled? And will we be notified when the comment window is open?
Charles, that's a fantastic observation, and I think it's well within our capability that if you've registered within this workshop, we can utilize your contact information going forward. We'll, of course, reach out to our technical team to make sure that that works. But we'll also do another round of notification to the community to alert them through traditional methods of the newspaper articles, social media, mailers, and postings in local newspapers as well, so that everybody's aware of when our next round of workshops are available in early 2021 to take a look at the future contours. The comment window is currently open on the baseline contours, so you'll have the chance to make your comments through November 13th. That's, I think, in about 2 weeks. And you can send your comments to the Airport Noise Hotline at sanantonio.gov, or you can mail them to the mailing address that was provided in the instructions video earlier in this presentation and also at the conclusion. So I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. The next question is for Chris. How is the noise model validated or verified? In other words, how do you know the noise model matches the actual noise exposure?
Thanks, Adam, for relaying that question. The noise model is developed by the Federal Aviation Administration, but that model, the one that we use, is called the Aviation Environmental Design Tool. That model was not developed in a vacuum by any means. And as a matter of fact, the heritage of AEDT goes back to the late 1970s when the FAA first produced a model known as the Integrated Noise Model, or INM. And during the late 70s and the early and mid 80s, a group of industry experts were gathered. And as a matter of fact, a specific technical group was created known as SAE A21. And that group was a group of industry experts, representatives from manufacturers and government, including the FAA, to essentially develop and collaborate on methodologies for modeling aircraft noise in the vicinity of airports. And those modeling methodologies became industry standard, part of AEDT, INM, and have even been used internationally at the International Civil Aviation Organization Committee on Aviation Environmental Protection, or ICAO CAPE. The validation process for the algorithms used in AEDT include a variety of research by the FAA as well as other stakeholders, comparing AEDT's output to measurement campaigns. Some of those measurement campaigns have been undertaken by the FAA. Others have been undertaken by a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation known as Volpe Center. And the FAA and Volpe Center are both part of DOT and work together regularly on noise research and other aspects of aviation environmental research. So through industry standards, analysis, and research, as well as measurement campaigns, the FAA has become very confident in the accuracy of AEDT. And as I mentioned earlier, the heritage of AEDT goes all the way back to the late 70s, and as well as 14 CFR Part 150 itself. 14 CFR Part 150 was created in the 80s in response to a congressional mandate for the FAA to determine a standard way of measuring and expressing aircraft noise. So there is quite a bit of history there, and you can read more about that modeling history and the accuracy of the model at the FAA's AEDT website, and that's aedt.faa.gov.
Thank you. The next question is for Neil. What are stakeholders' roles and responsibilities?
Thank you, Autumn. So we covered this a little bit during the presentation, but this is a good time to kind of go back to it and talk about it in a little bit more detail. So the stakeholders kind of align with the framework of how noise is regulated in the airport environment. So at the kind of the top level, if you look at it, a tiered system, a three-tier system, you've got the federal laws that regulate, that basically set aircraft noise standards. They prescribe operating rules, establish the compatibility planning process, and importantly, limit an airport's ability to restrict aircraft operations. So below that, you've got kind of the second tier, which is at the state level. And so states set laws regarding compatibility planning guidelines, noise standards, but they do not have any ability to regulate anything related to aircraft. And then the bottom part of that tiered system is kind of the local, the community where noise ordinances can be set and some noise standards. And probably most importantly, they provide for compatible land use planning. And again, they do not have the ability to regulate anything related to aircraft. So that's kind of on the framework side of things. And then if you look over on the stakeholder, same kind of tiered alignment. So at the federal level, you've got the Federal Aviation Administration. So they control aircraft while they're in flight. They're responsible for controlling noise at its source, so basically at an aircraft engine. And they also certify aircraft and pilots. And then just kind of going along on the paired tiering system at the local level, the local governments and states, they promote compatible land use planning through zoning. They can, in some instances, require real estate disclosures, although that's seems to be fairly uncommon. And again, they can also mandate sound insulating materials in construction. And then at the bottom of that tier on the stakeholder side are the airport operators. And of course, in this instance, that's San Antonio Airport. As you probably figured out, they really have very limited authority to adopt local restrictions or influence how aircraft operate at the airport, especially once they leave the ground. So basically, the airport's primary mission is to make sure that the airport's operated in a safe and efficient manner. And really, they focus on capital improvement projects that fulfill or support that mission.
Thank you, Neil. Our next question is for Chris again. Is topography a factor in determining the contours? Might aircraft noise exposure be higher in communities closest to creekways, whereby the downward slopes produce an almost echoing effect?
Thanks, Autumn, for relaying that question. For this noise study, we did include topography, or as we typically say, terrain data in the modeling process, and the FAA's AEDT actually provides a standard way to obtain published terrain data, and I'm talking about data that's published by the U.S. Geological Survey. It's publicly available for download, and we incorporate that into our model for the exact reasons just mentioned in the question, that is to say, to closely represent the distance between aircraft operations and people on the ground, and that includes mountains, that includes valleys, and all those things are directly represented in the distance calculation to appropriately calculate noise levels regardless of elevation. Furthermore, the AEDT database has the airport elevation as well as the elevation of different runway ends to make that calculation even more accurate.
In Autumn, I would just add on to what Chris described is while it accounts for the distance above the ground where aircraft are, so if you're on a hilltop, the aircraft would be closer to you if you were down at a lower elevation. The model doesn't account for echoing effects or canyon effects as they've been called. Those typically contribute in a very minor way to the noise levels, although they're audible. They typically don't increase the size of the contours substantially.
Thank you. The next question is for Mike. If I want to change the DNL noise metric or the level of annoyance, which is DNL 65, how can I do that?
Thank you. There was a push for the FAA to actually do a reevaluation of the DNL metric. Earlier this year, the FAA issued a report to Congress that included both an outline, an evaluation of the DNL metric, as well as the potential use of alternative metrics. Over the last 30 years, the FAA has done a number of studies and evaluations and reaffirmed the use of the DNL moving forward. And the study that was issued earlier this year, again, made the case that the DNL is the most appropriate metric for use in determining impacts for both noise studies as well as National Environmental Policy Act or environmental studies related to airport improvements or expansions. Why does the FAA use the DNL? The DNL includes the noise levels and number of events experienced in an average day into a single average sound level. The idea being that a single overflight might be noticeable and even annoying for some, but not others. However, at some level of overall noise exposure, combination of the noise levels and overflight frequency, it can be expected that a high percentage of people are either annoyed or highly annoyed. And the FAA has developed land use guidance that correlates to these levels. A few years ago, the FAA initiated another review of the different DNL levels when it comes to the 65 to try to determine if the 65 is the appropriate level for significance for non-compatible or noise-sensitive land uses. And at this point, no additional guidance or policy has been issued relative to that analysis. So for the purposes of our Part 150 and the noise exposure map report that we are in the process of, we're required to use the 65 DNL contour as our level or threshold of compatibility for those noise sensitive uses.
Thank you. Next question is for Steve. Who holds pilots accountable for following noise abatement departure plans and procedures?
So the ultimate agency that has authority over the use of the National Airspace System, or NAS as it's referred to, is the Federal Aviation Administration. And all the pilots who operate their aircraft within the National Airspace System have to follow the procedures and adhere to the procedures. And the Flight Standard Division Office, or FSDO, is the specific office within the FAA that would look into potential deviations from procedures. Now, in most cases, noise abatement procedures, like other types of procedures, have some level of flexibility in them, some tolerances in them based on controller technique, pilot technique, that type of thing. But there are a number of procedures, particularly arrival and departure procedures, that have very hard altitudes set in them, specific places at which the aircraft's supposed to be at a specific point in time. And if the pilots don't adhere to those specific procedures, then there could be an investigation by the FAA and disciplinary action on the part of the Federal Aviation Administration. In most cases, noise abatement procedures are typically voluntary. And so, and if the pilot remains within the bounds of safe operation of the aircraft, then you generally would not see any disciplinary action related to noise abatement procedures.
Thank you. And Chris, Steve mentioned that there are these procedures and they have tolerances that you can fly within. Can you explain what's modeled? Are the aircraft expected to just take the exact path, or do you model deviations?
Thanks, Autumn, for relaying that question. I'll build on what Steve said just a moment ago relating to all aircraft in flight ultimately being under control of the FAA through various ways, such as regulations, and oftentimes for commercial aircraft through direct commands from air traffic control. But I would also echo that also per regulation, the pilot in command of the aircraft has the ultimate authority for the safe operation of that aircraft. So aircraft may deviate, so to speak, from published procedures for a variety of reasons. Many of those reasons for commercial aircraft involve direct command from air traffic control, which could involve moving aircraft from one procedure to another. It could involve turning aircraft to keep them safely separated from each other and from obstacles. It could involve sequencing aircraft to verify and ensure that aircraft are in the right place at the right time, especially for safe landing. And ultimately, all aircraft in operation must follow various criteria for remaining safely in flight. And those criteria vary from aircraft type to aircraft type. And they even vary with weather conditions. Things like winds and temperature have a big impact on aircraft performance and also affect where aircraft are ultimately located in the airspace. Now, the good news is that we have historical records of aircraft flight tracks as well as aircraft types, and we use that directly in the noise model to produce the existing condition noise exposure map that was shown in this presentation. And furthermore, that data gives us a good picture of potential future flight tracks. And as Mike Arnold talked about earlier, we will also be looking into what future aircraft types may be. And that information would inform the development of our future noise exposure map to be presented next year.
Thank you. Our next question is for Steve. What happens if the noise comes roaring back within a year?
Well, in terms of the Part 150 noise exposure map update process, what we will see in terms of operations is an increase in operation, probably more activity at the airport, and then that would be used for forecasting the 2026 noise exposure map. So everything that we do in terms of the 2026 map is going to reflect the change between now, or what we anticipate will be the change now between now and what we expect to see in 2026. Let's say, however, once those maps are updated and those forecasts are out, and it appears as though we underestimated or overestimated those operations, then the airport and the city has undertaken a process of updating those noise exposure maps on about an every 5-year process. And so, of course, I can't commit the city to doing that, but because of the regular way in which they've looked at noise exposure, I assume that they would take a look at those future maps if it appears as though there's a disconnect between what we forecast in terms of the 2026 operation and what begins happening in terms of operations roaring back. I think Mike Arnold may have alluded to it earlier, but certainly it's uncertain what's going to happen until the COVID-19 pandemic is under control, and it's still a while off before we'll see that happen.
Thank you. Our next question is from Mike. Have aircraft really gotten quieter? It does not seem like it.
Yeah, so aircraft have actually gotten quite a bit quieter. The noisiest aircraft that were in the fleet most recently were referred to as Stage 2 aircraft. Stage references are references to the aircraft certification noise level. As an aircraft is being certified, it not only receives a flight certification, but it has to go through a process that certifies that it meets certain stage levels. And as those stage levels increase in number, the actual noise reduction or noise levels that those aircraft are allowed to produce decreases. And so there's been an implementation process that has transitioned the requirements for aircraft over time. Stage 2 was the aircraft category that was most recently phased out in the early 2000s. All aircraft that are currently operating in the U.S. fleet currently meet Stage 3, 4, or 5 standards. Stage 3, the transition from Stage 3 to 4, required a 10 decibel reduction in cumulative noise measurements relative to how the FAA evaluates those criteria. And the transition from Stage 4 to 5 required an additional 7 decibel reduction. So newer aircraft being developed today and being certified today meet those Stage 5 requirements. The FAA just in August of this year, the Government Accountability Office actually in August of this year issued a report to Congress. It was called GAO-20-661 is the number. And the report title was Information on a Potential Mandated Transition to Quieter Airplanes. And this report was issued in response to Section 186 of the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2018, which I referred to earlier, the same act that required evaluation of the DNL metric. This report concluded that while a number of the aircraft operating in the U.S. fleet were certified as meeting Stage 3, many of those aircraft actually meet the more stringent Stage 4 or 5 standards. In fact, GAO estimated that 96% of commercial aircraft operating at the beginning of this year would likely meet those standards. And while the GAO report acknowledged but did not consider the accelerated retirement that I spoke of earlier, some of those older, less efficient aircraft, as airlines have adjusted their operations to the reduction in travel resulting from the COVID-19 epidemic. So it's likely that that the actual number of aircraft meeting those 4 or 5 standards at this point in time is likely even higher. So yes, the answer is yes. Aircraft are getting quieter. I know for those of you that are right under flight paths, it may seem that way. It may not seem that way, but they are, in fact, quite a bit quieter than they were maybe 20 years ago or so.
Thank you. The next question is for Joshua. How does the airport work with the FAA to reduce noise?
Thank you. There's a number of measures in place: noise abatement and noise mitigation. Our noise compatibility program, which was last updated in 2014, outlines a number of the noise abatement and noise mitigation measures in detail. I'll cover a couple of the quick highlights, but typically you have something along the lines of about 11 different noise abatement measures and about 4 noise mitigation measures that are proposed to the FAA and set in different status of approval, disapproval. And when we talk noise abatement, that's where you have discussions about voluntary noise abatement departure procedures to reduce noise levels from aircraft operations, preferential use of runways, departures, establishing corridors off of runways. Now, some of these are proposed actions that the FAA disapproves because of flight efficiency standards that need to be maintained. But other elements of this are approved, like the installation of a noise operations monitoring system, which I use to help track flights that correlate to concerns from the community and noise-related events. Installation of the ground run-up enclosure. And then for noise mitigation, we had elements in our noise compatibility program that included continuing the residential acoustical treatment within the noise mitigation boundaries, continuing to provide acoustical treatment for noise-sensitive facilities like schools or other areas that were identified, identification of noise exposure acknowledgments in real estate transactions. So these types of things are all part of the noise compatibility program. And, as we move forward with this, we may be in store for an update to this program with additional measures going into the future. That's kind of how we worked with the FAA in these accommodated abatement and mitigation measures to reduce noise.
Thanks. And following up on that, Joshua, who advocates for resident noise concerns?
Thank you, Autumn. When we talk about advocates for residents for noise concerns, that's one of the primary responsibilities out of my office, and reporting to Steve and reporting to airport leadership and identifying where the concerns from the community come from, the types of concerns that are collected, and responding in a timely manner to the community to explain the conditions that are causing aircraft noise. And that can include things like runway closures or military aircraft operations that I was explaining earlier. And I report to the airport leadership and the Airport Advisory Committee, AAC, every month to identify monthly totals on aircraft noise, concerns from the community, the types of concerns, the distances from the airport, and the clusters where the calls come in. So people can keep aware of it, and I often am the middle point to identifying what the conditions are that are causing the noise and trying to provide that back to the community, as well as, Steve and I advocating for executing on this noise exposure map to identify to the community where future noise contours are going to be so we can plan accordingly with those noise events. Steve Southers, I'll ask you if you have other inputs you want to add to this.
No, that was a fine answer, Josh.
Thank you. The next question is for Steve. Can the public, through these meetings, actually have an influence on changes to the 2026 noise planning? And if so, what would be the areas that the public could have input?
Thank you, Autumn, for relaying that question. And the answer is yes. The whole reason for holding these public workshops and creating opportunities for comment on the document is to get public input about the work that we've done. And in particular, reviewing the operations level, taking a look at the flight tracks, taking a look at the land use assumptions that we've made. Does it all make sense? Did we miss anything? Are there particular items that we should take a look at? Again, to stress, we're simply looking at defining the noise exposure for 2021, and as that question pointed out, 2026. So in reviewing the 2026 noise exposure map in a draft form, it's important for the public to review and comment on any aspect of that map that doesn't seem to make sense to them. And we'll review those comments, we'll respond to them, and if there's an area where the community sees something that we didn't see, we'll obviously consult with the City of San Antonio and make changes as necessary as a part of this process. But public input is a really key factor for developing these noise exposure maps.
Thank you. The next question, I'm not sure if it's best handled by you, Steve Alberson, or Joshua. When cargo carriers depart runway 22, it appears the departure is steeper than a passenger carrier plane. Is that done to reduce the total noise exposure?
I'll defer to Joshua and hop in if I can add anything.
Each airline and each pilot is in control of the plane upon their departure, and I'll admit that oftentimes it appears that some of the cargo carriers can get away with a steeper climb on a departure, as they don't always have passengers in the plane. If you had passengers in the plane and you executed a steep departure, it's going to be unpleasant for everybody on board. So they can at times execute the steep climb to get them to altitude so they can make their turn to their next waypoint in a faster manner, and the allowances of their package and how they're put together can allow them different tolerances for how they fly. The answer is a little off the cuff, but Steve, I'll ask if you have any other inputs you want to refine on that. That'd be great.
Yeah, Joshua, you covered the types of things that I would have covered. Each aircraft operator, whether it be an airline, passenger airline, or an air cargo operator, have their own set of noise abatement departure procedures that they use at each airport throughout the United States. And they can actually vary from aircraft type to aircraft type, or from the same aircraft type for one airline to the same aircraft type for another. Also, as you alluded to, the load factor is really important on aircraft performance. In some cases, depending on how heavily those cargo aircraft are loaded, they could climb at a much quicker rate, or if they're more heavily loaded, they could climb at a much slower rate. The one thing we have seen is the passenger aircraft have been carrying pretty full loads over the last several years, and with a full load, and particularly if they're going to longer destinations, they'll take a little bit longer to climb out with a lighter load factor. So there are a number of different factors that are here. I guess I would encourage this particular questioner, if they see something on a consistent basis, to email the noise office or to give Joshua a call, and then using the flight track and noise monitoring system, it can be investigated.
Stephen, I thought I would jump in here. You gave the example of, you talked about how we consider the public's input relative to our assumptions. The cargo operations at the airport are one item that has come up as a theme throughout every workshop that we've held, and concerns about that nighttime activity, how the just-in-time delivery process has affected cargo activity. Clearly, that's an area that we're going to focus in very closely as we look at the 2026 assumptions.
I'll also add that pilots that utilize the Jepson charts and they find details about specific airports, and there are notes in there about airspace configuration requirements and hazards and beacon locations. There's also discussions about voluntary noise abatement departure profiles, and it identifies to utilize those when it's safe, and being aware of noise sensitive communities surrounding the San Antonio airport.
Thank you all. The next question is for Mike. How many noise studies has ESA completed?
I don't know if I have enough gray hair to answer that one. But it is hundreds, if not thousands, of studies across the United States. This is a particular area of specialty for ESA. ESA is an environmental consulting firm that specializes in airport noise and environmental studies. Very unique skill set, and we do these types of evaluations at airports of all size across the country. Just about every location you can name: New York, LA, San Francisco, Miami. We are actively involved in projects evaluating noise and working with airports that are trying to address community noise concerns around their airports.
Thank you. Next question is for Chris. Does this study take into account helicopter noise?
Thanks for relaying that question. The answer is very simply yes, it does. There were approximately 2,800 helicopter operations that are modeled for our noise exposure map. And as with the fixed wing operations, that helicopter operational data is based on actual observed operations at the airport. The AEDT provides a number of helicopter models that are ready for use, and that includes single and twin engine helicopters. It includes helicopters with skids, helicopters with wheels, some helicopters that are medium and large size, and some helicopters that you might consider to be a fairly small helicopter type. That includes piston and turbine helicopters as well. And for each of those helicopter models, AEDT provides the standard operational profiles that have been based on manufacturer provided as well as FAA gathered research data. And we use that in the AEDT to model helicopter operations for our noise exposure map.
Thank you. Next question is for Steve. What is non-compatible land?
So 14 CFR Part 150 defines non-compatible land use as noise-sensitive land uses such as residences, schools, places of worship, hospitals, libraries, etc., that are within the 65 DNL contours and higher. Land uses, noise-sensitive land uses, and all uses, in fact, that are outside of the 65 DNL contour, essentially 64 and lower, are considered compatible with the operations of the airport. So when you see our report, and if there are any of these noise-sensitive uses within the noise contours, they would be listed as non-compatible. All those uses that are outside are considered compatible, and obviously we wouldn't list those.
Thank you. The next question is for Mike. How will the study benefit me and my community?
Well, as we know, the airport is going through this study to update and understand what that noise exposure is in the surrounding community. So the way that it really benefits the community, it's helping understand what the noise exposure conditions are, what the airport can do about it, whether there's land uses around the airport that are considered non-compatible with noise exposure. It allows us to take a snapshot in time of essentially the existing conditions and to look out into the future and say, what are the conditions going to be in the future? So it helps people become informed about the noise exposure conditions, what the limitations of the federal regulations are, what control or capabilities the airport has to be able to affect things, and it allows a mechanism for the community to interact with the airport and relay their concerns.
Thank you. I'm actually going to take the next question. It is requesting the website where the materials from this meeting can be found. I'm going to give it verbally, but we'll see if someone can send it through the question and answer portal for them. And we'll also pull it up on the slide at the closing at the end of the night. But the airport's noise office website can be found at fly-business/about-environmental-stewardship. And it's a pretty long address, but we'll pull it up at the end of the meeting and you can see it. We'll get you taken care of. Okay, the next question is for Steve. I hear there might be a rollout of FAA's GIS navigation system. Will that affect noise if it happens?
Thank you for passing on that question, Autumn. And I think the questioner might have meant to say GPS or Global Positioning System. And yes, the FAA has been rolling out through what's referred to as a next-gen effort and through a subset of that called the Metroplex processes or PBM procedures, new procedures throughout the United States to try to make use of the airspace more efficient, more safe, and the global positioning satellite systems play a big role in that. It's hard to tell whether there would be changes in the noise exposure as a result of that. In some instances in other parts of the country, the use of the GPS has sort of focused or concentrated flight tracks over areas that didn't receive such concentrations before, and it certainly raised community concerns. But we wouldn't speculate here as to what might happen until we actually know what the FAA's plans are. If those plans should develop during the course of our planning toward developing the 2026 noise exposure map, we would definitely include those new flight procedures in the 2026 noise exposure map and reflect those in the noise exposure map. And Steve Southers, I think you might be familiar with some of the efforts that FAA is going on, and just wanted to give you the opportunity to add to that question if you had anything to add.
Thank you. No, your answer was fine. Thank you.
Thank you. The next question is for Mike. I realize that the NEM affects the zoning and compatible land, but will the new NEM affect the operation of the airfield?
Well, and again, what we're trying to do is evaluate what the conditions currently are and what they would be in the future based on the operational characteristics of the airport as we know them and as we anticipate to change them, or that they might change over time. The NEM update is not proposing to make any modifications to how aircraft operate. What we're trying to do is just understand what that noise exposure is and whether there are non-compatible land uses exposed to that within the thresholds of significance.
Okay. The next question is for Joshua. Was the airport considering phasing out the use of the north side runway and creating an east-west one? Is this in the future plan, or was it a rumor?
Thank you, Autumn. To take a look at what future plans hold for runway utilization and layout, callers will have to visit the airport strategic development plan or the strategic development plan website, and that'll have the latest set of milestones for public meetings, planned airport layouts, and the phases that those plans are in. For our considerations and purposes tonight in this meeting, we're going to talk about noise exposure map updates. So the focus of future plans at the airport is strictly to be directed to the strategic development plan.
Thank you. The next question is for Chris. What are the assumptions used in the study, and where can I find that information?
Thanks for relaying that question, Autumn. I'm going to aggregate the assumptions into a couple of key categories, and then I'll point to some FAA provided documentation where you can read more about that. In terms of our assumptions, I'm just looking at some references here. The categories are very simple. It essentially comes down to assumptions on aircraft type, aircraft performance and flight path, airport weather, and for nearly everything else we use recorded data. So for instance, aircraft flight paths horizontally, in other words left and right or latitude and longitude, come directly from the flight track data source that we use, which actually records historical flight tracks and aircraft types. That goes directly into our model, and where the assumptions come in for that is the FAA has provided aircraft performance data in its database that includes certification data for noise levels. It also includes manufacturer-provided aircraft performance data, but as an example, the FAA provides guidance to manufacturers to provide aircraft performance data assuming a 65% load factor. And that essentially standardizes the type of data that manufacturers provide. In order to represent aircraft weights, we look at the aircraft distances in terms of where departures are flying. Typically, aircraft flying further or farther, I'm sorry, as mentioned in the presentation, need to take on more fuel and therefore have a higher, what we call stage length. And that stage length is an assumed proxy for the aircraft weight. And aircraft weight also affects aircraft noise levels. So that's an example of an assumption on aircraft performance. We also have a database of FAA-provided weather for the San Antonio International Airport. It is based on weather databases that are provided by the U.S. government, and those weather conditions represent a number of years of weather. I believe it's either 10-year or 30-year averages of weather. And then there is an implied assumption there, which is to say that average weather is a good pairing for our average noise metric, in this case, the day-night average sound level. Another set of assumptions is based on the way that sound propagates. So there is an industry standard algorithm built into the AEDT that uses airport weather as a basis for essentially calculating how noise travels from the aircraft down to people on the ground. And my summary is that there are a number of assumptions that are built into any model, and models are always getting better all the time. In using the latest model, the latest version of AEDT, which is version 3C, we are incorporating not only the latest aircraft data and the latest airport data provided by the FAA, but we're also incorporating the latest industry standard algorithms provided by the FAA. And as I mentioned previously, those algorithms were developed at the national and have also been used at the international levels in collaboration with aircraft operators, aircraft manufacturers, and government agencies like the FAA. We use a pressure altitude, just building on that question a little bit more. The FAA's database for San Antonio has a pressure altitude of 29.15 inches of mercury. And again, that's based on the average weather over a number of years that has been provided in that database. And in reviewing the weather for San Antonio International Airport at different points of this year, we were able to see that there were a number of days where air pressure was higher and a number of days where air pressure was also lower than 29.15 inches of mercury at the airport. So we believe that the FAA's provided data for airport weather is fairly accurate and appropriate for our noise modeling. In terms of where you can read more about these assumptions, there are two places. One is already available, which is to say the FAA provides a technical manual for the Aviation and Environmental Design Tool that's available at the AEDT website, aedt.faa.gov. And the second piece in which you'll be able to find assumptions is currently under development, and that is a noise exposure map report, which will document the production of not only the existing condition noise exposure map for this study, but also the future year or 2026 noise exposure map that's been discussed in this question and answer session. That report will be released as a draft, which is to say that specifically we are inviting your review and comment on that draft NEM report, and those comments will be reviewed and incorporated and responded to in the final NEM report. That NEM report will be presented to the FAA, and ultimately, of course, our goal is for the FAA to accept that noise exposure map report and the noise exposure maps within it as the new official airport noise exposure maps for San Antonio International Airport. So it's certainly in our interest to represent the noise environment as accurately as we can using the most up-to-date data and methodologies.
Thank you, Chris. And we are at our last question of the evening. And I'm going to give it to Neil. When will the NEMs be submitted to the FAA?
Thank you. As a number of us have alluded to tonight, our next big milestone is the second set of workshops where we'll present the draft 2026 future conditions noise contours. Our goal after that is to receive your comments after that workshop and after the review of the draft NEM report, and then send that to FAA for their review of the draft. So there'll be some back and forth with them, but ultimately the goal is to get FAA's review and acceptance of the noise exposure maps by mid-2021, so sometime in midsummer around June or July. That's our ultimate goal here.
Thank you so much. And we want to thank you for joining us for today's virtual workshop. We hope you found the information helpful and informative. As a reminder, the public comment period is open until November 13th. Please follow the instructions provided on the airport's Noise Office website in the newspaper advertisement to submit your comments on the NEM update. Comments must be submitted or postmarked by 5 p.m. on November 13th. The email address is airportnoisehotline@sanantonio.gov, and the mailing address is San Antonio International Airport, 457 Sandow Road, Building 1039. Attention Environmental Stewardship, San Antonio, Texas, 78216. Today's meeting materials will be posted on the airport's Noise Office website, fly-about-SAS/environmental-stewardship. Thank you again for joining us tonight. We really appreciate your participation. Have a great evening.